Your baby will literally feed easier, require less stimulation to stay awake for the feed, and transfer more breast milk when you're feeding on cue. What does it mean to feed on cue? It means you're looking for signs of hunger in your baby. Early feeding cues are when babies bring their hands to their mouth, transition from sleeping to waking, turn their head side to side, stick their tongue out of their mouth, smack their lips, clench their little hands into a fist, and become restless. Crying is a late feeding cue. It's always more difficult to get your baby to latch when he's crying. Pro tip: if you're starting a feeding with a late feeding cue, place your baby skin to skin and get him to calm down before latching. It's almost impossible to get a newborn to latch when they're crying. It can also be really helpful to get him to latch if you latch him onto your clean finger, let him suck on it for a few minutes, and then transfer him to your breast. Let me give you a few real-life examples of what I'm talking about related to feeding on cue. I walked into a couple's room who had a 2-day-old baby. They had been struggling to get their baby to wake up for feeds. The baby was swaddled in the bassinet, going to town on a pacifier. We'll talk about passies in more detail later, but here I just want you to note it. I offered to help with the feeding. The couple declined and asked if I would come back in an hour when it would be his scheduled time to feed. They explained they were feeding him every 3 hours. I explained how the hormone prolactin works with breastfeeding, and I really encouraged them to feed on cue instead of scheduled feeds. They insisted they would like to wait until his scheduled feeding time, and I agreed to come back later. About an hour later, the couple called me back to their room. The pediatrician had been by to see their baby and mentioned he was approaching 10% loss of his birth weight. She was concerned, and she wanted to make sure the couple had a feeding plan for going home. We attempted to wake the baby for the feeding, as it had now been about 3.5 hours since his last feeding. He was frantic at first, disorganized, and difficult to latch. He finally latched and gave a few good sucks, but immediately fell asleep at the breast. The couple explained that it had been a chore to get him to feed vigorously. He was eating for less than 10 minutes at each feeding. I pointed out the difference in non-nutritive sucking and active suck swallowing. The couple agreed that most of his feeds had been non-nutritive sucking, and they really hadn't noticed him swallowing. The couple were now really concerned about his weight loss, and they asked me to help them figure out a plan so they could continue to breastfeed. I educated them again on the importance of feeding on cue and how their baby would have more effective feeds when they did that. I also encouraged mom to pump since her baby wasn't feeding very vigorously and was now at about 10% loss of his birth weight. We'll talk about the plan for situations like this later in the course. The next couple were second-time parents. They'd come into it eyes wide open this time. They struggled with breastfeeding with their last baby. After talking with them, they'd made similar mistakes to the couple we just talked about. Doing more scheduled feeds during the first 2 weeks, the mother ended up having a supply issue within the first 2 weeks, and they needed to start supplementing with formula. I assisted with latching, and the baby was actively sucking and swallowing at the breast. After finishing the feeding, the mom was anxious to hook up to her breast pump. She'd been pumping for about 15 to 20 minutes after each feeding. She wanted to make sure she didn't have any supply issues this time. I assured her she was off to a great start and her baby was feeding effectively at the breast. She was feeding on cue and getting adequate stimulation for her breast milk supply to be in tune with what her baby needed. We talked about overstimulation and the potential of creating an oversupply and all the complications related to an oversupply. We'll talk about this later in the course as well. She thanked me for the information, but she was adamant she wanted to continue to pump after each feeding. A few weeks later, she called me crying, upset that her baby wasn't latching easily due to her forceful letdown and oversupply. She was constantly engorged and in pain, and she had to pump every 2 hours or she'd end up engorged and unable to care for her 2 children due to her painful breasts. She constantly had clogged ducts and figured it was a matter of time before she developed mastitis. I wasn't surprised to hear from her. Her routine she'd started from day one made her body think she was feeding twins when she only had one baby. The last couple got it right. They were realistic with their expectations. They had taken a breastfeeding class prior to delivery. They understood how breast milk production worked, and they knew about potential complications that could come up. I walked into their room and they told me they had been feeding their baby on cue every 1.5 to 3.5 hours. They looked for early feeding cues, and that's when they started feeds. Their baby was feeding for about 15 to 25 minutes each feeding. They weren't following a schedule, but they planned to follow a feeding, wake, sleep cycle during the first 2 weeks. It had been working great so far. Their baby was ready to eat when waking up, and they noticed if they missed feeding cues or delayed feeds, it made the latch more difficult and their baby wouldn't feed vigorously. I encouraged them to continue their feeds on cue, and I told them they were doing a great job. I asked them if they were getting some rest, and they both said yes. They felt that feeding on cue helped the feeds be more effective and required them to do less stimulation of their baby, which can be exhausting. They were getting in good feeds, and all 3 of them were resting between feeds. I followed up with them about a week later to check in and see how things were going. Their baby was above birth weight. They were feeding about 8 to 9 times a day with 1 4-hour stretch at night. They felt confident their baby was getting enough and had no concerns. I told you about these 3 stories because it's real life, and I really want you to understand how important it is to feed on cue.